Hi, welcome to ANC Connect. My name is Fasiya Hassan. Today, I'm really excited to be interviewing Comrade Ebrahim Rasool. I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. But there's also a kind of funny story that I think is going to come through in the latter part of our podcast and our discussion. You won't know this, but Comrade Ebrahim, I know he looks young, but he qualifies to be in the Veterans League and I'm in the Youth League. So today's a real intergenerational discussion. And so I'm hoping that we'll have some meeting of minds, but also maybe a bit of a discussion or disagreement here or there. Comrade Ebrahim, for people who have been following your work, most recently there's been the Global AntiApartheid Conference. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that is, but also why it's important that as South Africa, as an ANC-led government South Africa, that we've effectively hosted that conference.
You know, Fasiha, the issue is that the world gathered in Johannesburg and South Africa from all walks of life, thousands of people, and they're all coming here to strategize, but essentially they're coming here to say thank you to South Africa. I travel the world. I get all the glory when I meet people and I say I'm South African because they are just so happy that this tiny country on the tip of Africa has had the guts to go up against Israel, hold it in front of the International Court of Justice, and then win a seminal battle against Israel that has inspired these protests across the campuses of the world, that has turned the street against the palace, the street against the White House, the street against 10 Downing Street, all over Europe and all over the Western world, and also all over the Muslim world. And that's what this tiny country has done. And they savor us, not as an economic or military superpower, but again, South Africa has become a moral superpower in the world. That's the enormity of what just went down over the past weekend in Johannesburg at the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference. And rubbing shoulders with people like Mustafa Barghouti, the leadership. Linda Sarsour was here. If you can just imagine the caliber of people who all came here.
For those who don't know, these are the people we follow on social media. These are activists all over the world who are openly advocating for Palestinian activism, or liberation rather, and they were all gathered in one place. What were some of the outcomes of this conference?
Look, I think that the outcomes were necessarily the call to consolidate the victories of the ICJ, not slip back on it, to now turn it into meaningful actions, such as accelerate the boycott and divestment campaigns, and to make sure, and the reverberations of that are going to be quite significant. And certainly I think it is to exhort South Africa to continue with the work that it is doing in the legal diplomatic space, so that, and offline people say, can we now move from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to the ICC, the International Criminal Court? Because the pressure the US put us under to arrest Putin was, for whom there was an arrest warrant. We need to use the same strategies with Netanyahu, with Gallant, with Herzog, and really make sure that their movement is significantly curtailed because they are charged with war crime. But look, those are the kind of concrete strategies that I think came out of a weekend of enormous solidarity.
No, you're quite right. One of the things that's come out is the hypocrisy of the Western world. So there's international law for us, for the global South, and then there's a different set of rules. I mean, even the intimidation of the ICJ and the ICC, actually. I mean, Israel said they would start to sanction members or judges, I think it is, of the ICC. What does that mean for us as South Africa? I mean, staring down the Western bloc is not an easy process. What are we looking at here? And why is it important also that we should?
No, you see, this hypocrisy that you speak about was so stark. Just a few months prior to Gaza, the Western world were crying crocodile tears, and with right, for blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainians who were dying in Ukraine. When their humanity was tested in October, They were found wanting. Their humanity was lacking. Their empathy was absent. And suddenly, the crocodile tears became bile that they spat at South Africa for taking on Israel. And so I think what we have exposed inadvertently is a global apartheid. There is one rule for blonde, blue-eyed, white-skinned people, and there's one for the browner and blacker people of the world. And so this is the enormous moral responsibility that falls on the country like South Africa that has defeated its demons, the demon of apartheid, and much is expected of us now.
And I think there's a need also for continued pressure. So right now we're also seeing different university campuses, even in South Africa, who are now also creating their own encampments, also forcing for some level of divestment and sanctions. We know the Olympics, there's a whole campaign to get Israel out on that. But there's another important point here, and I think it's important for us to link what this moment, this ICJ moment, has meant in terms of ANC renewal. And I'll tell you what I view it as a young person. You know, for the first time in a long time, so many South Africans were proud. Were so proud of the government, so proud of the country, so proud of the ANC. And it showed us, I think, what the moral caliber of the ANC truly is. And is that not one in one with this ANC renewal that we always talk about?
I think you're absolutely right. So many people thank us as South Africans for what we did at the ICJ. Yeah. My sense is, wherever I meet the Palestinians, I thank them for the gift they gave the ANC. They gave us back our moral compass. They gave us back our true north. They gave us back our historical purpose in this world. And we can erase 10 years of aberration and rejoice in the 112 years of ANC steadfastness on its principles, which I think is now jumping at the world. And the fact that it comes under such enormous threat from the United States, who wants to kick us out of trade arrangements and so forth.
Bully us.
Bully us. Shows that this is not a cynical or a cheap or a thoughtless thing that South Africa has done. It's a considered act of sacrifice for the Palestinian people. So the Palestinians have given us an enormous gift. And I think it makes us proud again. And that's why we are seeing everyone coming out to campaign for the ANC, because this is the crucial moment that we cannot dare to falter.
And I think it's humbling, right? To hear you thankful to Palestinians. It reminds us that it's exactly what you said. It's not us doing it for electioneering. People forget that the ANC has, from the very beginning or the very inception of Palestinian resistance, we were there. We have supported it from a time when it was incredibly unpopular, and actually it's still unpopular now. The fact of the matter is that the stakes are really, really high. But I want to talk a little bit more about renewal, because it sometimes sounds like this airy-fairy thing. You know, it doesn't have this tangible quality that for people to understand. What does renewal actually mean when we talk about it?
No, Fasiha, it is the renewal in the sense that we have reasserted our moral compass in the world. That is renewal. It is that we have a President Ramaphosa, that is actively putting in place strategies for not only regaining our moral center, but reasserting that South Africa as a country must be on the right path. But you know, the starkness of this renewal came to me when about 2-3 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. leading a development bank delegation and negotiating with the World Bank, the IMF, and the global investors. And lots of money is at stake. I was asked, how can we put our money in a country that's corrupt? And suddenly, it hit me between the eyes, and I thought very deeply and very fast about it. And then I said, actually, we are renewing. And I said, I want to tell you that we have been infected with a germ of corruption, like a body that's infected with diabetes. But let me tell you, now that you're forcing me to think about it, when the first 3 toes were infected, we cut it off. We amputated. That was with the issue of the arms deal. Then, when we saw the VBS scandal and the infection reached our ankles, we amputated Today they run around in red in Parliament. Then we saw that even a former Secretary General was implicated in corruption in the Free State and that the infection had reached our shin. And what did we do? We amputated. Now I'm here with you and I can tell you, we have just completed the amputation of the high priest of corruption and his cohorts, who've now formed the MKP. And we amputated at the knee. We will rather walk with a crutch than walk with a gangrenous corruption within us. There may be a few more toes that we made, but we'll get to it, but the main infection has been cut. So what I'm saying, renewal for us has been a very painful period of amputating of our own body to make sure that the stain and the germ of corruption leaves the body politic of the African National Congress. Sorry about the very horrible
metaphor, visionary.
but I think it's the only way. And the response was, you have visually explained to us what we have not read in the media.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also when we talk about renewal, and this is us pushing this intergenerational part, it's not only about that fight about corruption. Of course, it's center stage, but it's also about getting new life, new leaders, getting that new burst of energy and thought and innovation into the party. But linked to that, it's very interesting. We're seeing now former President Thabo Mbeki, former President Kgalema Motlanthe joining the campaign trail. What does that tell us about the renewal agenda?
I think it attests to the sincerity of this renewal agenda, that the old guard know that this is a pivotal moment. The old guard know that our entire legacies are at stake. I don't want to give a generation of youth leaguers a damaged ANC. I don't want to give my children a country for which they must be shy. I want them to think of me as ANC with pride that my father helped to create this. I cannot go to my grave when my children are embarrassed to be in the ANC. And certainly the leadership that must take over must be a leadership that learns the noble history, but removes what I think is the memory stick of corruption, so that the hard drive is not filled with that.
A perfect analogy and a very good example of how our veterans actually do know technology. There's this idea that, you don't understand all the metaphors, but it's a perfect analogy on the USB, almost, and removing of that virus of the much greater cause. It's a funny thing, Comrade Ebrahim, people don't know this, but Comrade Ebrahim actually spoke at my parents' wedding. So when we talk about this exchange of knowledge, of ideas, and the exchange of that generation or your generation to ours, it's not an easy thing, because we look at the ANC and we say, well, are we digging deeper into the grave? Are our elders forcing us into a situation in which we may or may not be in coalitions, but it may not have the gravitas, or the ANC may not have the gravitas as it did before? And I think we come into contact with young people all the time, and they say to us, well, why? Why should we trust the ANC? And remember, for us, the dividend is different. We didn't live during apartheid. We've read about it. We've experienced it in documentaries. I wouldn't even say experience. And so there's a whole generation or whole group of South Africans who are saying, well, why should we trust the ANC's renewal agenda? You can say all you want, but why should we trust that, number one, it's going to work, but number two, that ANC renewal equals renewal in the state?
What I will say to our young people, and it's only because I have been in the streets of Cairo and Tunis and wherever the Arab Spring went, that our young people are bearing the fruits, are benefiting from the fruits of the enduring values that are in that Constitution and that Bill of Rights. Because where it is absent, counter-revolutions crush the spirit of young people and put them in jail and massacre them in the streets. I am so proud that through the dark years of the Zuma era, we had an activist judiciary. We had an investigative media. We had a robust civil society. And we were able to even get our young people into the streets to utilize the benefits of the Constitution. And maybe they didn't articulate it as such, but the fact that they were in the streets, that they could do the fees must fall, the roads must fall, that they could be the conscience of a movement that had lapsed, and then result in that movement coming back with an agenda for renewal. I think that it was almost as if our young people salvaged their own inheritance. That it wasn't handed down to them.
Yeah.
They salvaged it from a movement that momentarily had lapsed in its history.
And there's something to be said. I mean, as a former Fees Must Fall leader myself, as someone who's taken the ANC to task a number of different times, the fact that we could do that, the fact that you and I can have an honest, critical conversation about a governing structure and be in the governing structure, but also not worry about disappearing overnight, or worry about, I mean, people say this, all of your posts on X, people attack the president all the time, or Instagram, TikTok, and the fact that you're not arrested. I mean, these are really, really important democratic values and principles that often we take for granted because it's a norm, yes, but the reality is the ANC has fought for us to be at this point.
But Fasiha, your parents and I were in an organization called the Call of Islam.
Yes.
Who, when freedom came, we convened a National Muslim Conference and we put our desires, our hopes into that constitution. And the promise of a Nelson Mandela to all of us was that South Africa will essentially restore every South African's human dignity, fundamentally restore our human rights, and progressively restore our human needs. That was the great bargain in the transition up to 1994, that those were the things. And we must admit that the progressively restoring our human needs is slow and tardy and impeded often, but the fees must fall, roads must fall, the civil society that mobilized for pay back the money and all of those kind of things, all attest that the first two are perfectly intact. Our human dignity and our human rights. The third thing is falteringly coming.
Sure.
And I believe that President Ramaphosa is leading the acceleration of what it means to progressively restore our human needs. And already the signs are that we're beginning to sort out our energy, not just sort out the energy in the old way, but in a new way. Today there are 5,000 megawatts of renewable energy that has entered the grid. I think we're starting to invest in our infrastructure again so that our human needs can be restored. And then don't forget, what is so often missed by middle class people like myself is that 23 million people every month go to their post office.
Yes.
And get the wherewithal to keep the wolves of hunger and poverty from the door. And that is an enormous tribute that never stopped, even when we were in the midst of our great depression as a nation.
And I think there's an important point here for our listeners at home or our viewers at home. Load shedding is 60% better now than it was a year ago. And that's not because we're burning more diesel. It's fundamentally because this renewal project is now starting to bear fruit, not only in terms of the ANC, but in terms of our different policies
And
in
it's a
government.
renewal with renewables.
Literally. It's exactly what we want. Green energy and, of course, the ANC, black, green and gold. There must be some correlation there. I want to pick up on the Call of Islam. A lot of people, we read about the mainstream history of the struggle, and we read about parts of it, but there's another story here of comrades like yourself and activists like yourself who are very involved in our transition, in our freedom. But I want to talk also about what happened recently, the ruling from the international Muslim scholars and what they said. And then maybe we can talk about why that's also important now.
So we had a conference within a conference. Within the global conference, there was this...
An inception conference.
Yes, in which we got a delegation from the International Union of Muslim Scholars and a directive from its leader, Sheikh Ali al-Quradahi, who, for those of you who don't know the hierarchies in Islam, because we don't have a pope, but if Islam had an archbishop or a pope globally, Sheikh Ali al-Quradahi would be that, because he speaks for 94 countries and 30,000 ulama or clergy. And basically, they wanted to come to South Africa on what is in Arabic called a kalimat to shukr, an expression of gratitude for what South Africa has done in the ICJ against Israel, because they didn't see any other Muslim country do it. They didn't see any other Arab country do it. They didn't see a superpower do it. They didn't even see any other country do it. But South Africa did it. So they wanted to come to express their thanks. And then when we negotiated this, they asked, so what are the Muslims doing? I said, you know, the Muslims of South Africa are ambiguous about whether to vote for the ANC or not, or whether to vote for the DA. They said, Ya Allah, how can that be? And then they turned the shukr, the thanks, into a thanks and advice or directive. And basically what the directive says from the International Union of Muslim Scholars is that, one, it says, remember that God says in the Quran, do not take my enemies and your enemies as your friends and protectors, giving them your love. In other words, love in this case means your vote. You cannot do that to the enemies of God. And that clearly is the DA, the PA, and the ilk who get their money from Zionists and who therefore sing the songs that Zionists want them to sing. The next advice is, we know that you have had setbacks in this country and disappointments with the ruling party, but if your ruling party is not supported, Palestine recedes. And therefore, we ask you to vote for the African National Congress. And the African National Congress, we trust, will continue the fight, take the fight against Israel to the next level, as well as fight the internal issues that are needed for the renewal of South Africa itself. And so, never before has a clergy body come out so explicitly to urge Muslims, and all other people for that matter, to vote for the ANC, because we cannot afford a discontinuity in governance, because a discontinuity in governance is a setback for the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because the reality of the matter is that if it's not an ANC-led government, there's no guarantee that the ICJ case will get taken forward, number one. In fact, I'm quite sure that there'll be a complete stop, an end to the Palestinian resistance movement. And I'll tell you why. We're seeing the Zionist lobby fund so many opposition parties, and this is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence on the timing. It's not a coincidence in how they're doing it. I mean, even these popcorn parties that are coming up here and there, so many of them are funded by Zionists. I mean, including Rise and Zanzi, that a number of the Muslim community seems to think is an option. So I want to ask you about that. But I'm also interested to know this fatwa, this ruling that's come from the international body. Is it going to make a difference? Are our Muslim community going to come out and vote ANC? And again, why should they?
So, at the end of the day, we can't determine what people do when they are alone in that ballot box. But we can tell them that they're not alone. God is with them.
Allah sees all.
Allah sees all. But I'm very encouraged by the fact that this ruling has come. Secondly, we are going to have to make it work. So we've got to turn this ruling or this directive into pamphlets that must flood the mosques, so that every Muslim can read it for themselves and take it to their family and have family discussions about what do we do. And we need this also to become the basis of what the khutbahs or the sermons must be like over the next 2 weeks, so that the clergy can do what they must do. So I think we're going to have mixed results, because some people are still bothered about their potholes when there are craters in Gaza left by the Israeli bombs. Some people are still skeptical about whether 2 hours load shedding will come back, whereas Gaza has not had electricity for the last 7 months. Some people are still going to make decisions about whether their dirt is collected on time, whereas in Gaza, the children are rummaging through the dirt to get a morsel of food. So let's get, and in the words of the director from Sheikh Ali Al-Quradahi, the bigger picture is more important than the small picture, that your identity as a member of the global ummah trumps your identity as a citizen in some difficulty.
But even your rights as Muslims in this country, in South Africa, and I'll say it as a practicing Muslim, we practice openly. We're not afraid. We're not under forms of Islamophobia. We can go to the mosque easily. We can wear hijab. We can do all the things that make us Muslim in a country that does not vilify us for being Muslim. And that, in large part, is because of the same Freedom Charter, the same constitution, and of course an ANC-led government that has said this is a community that's really important, and this is a community we want to have in leadership positions of the ANC and of government, but also to say that this is a community that has been supported by the ANC historically.
You know, the emissary of Sheikh Ali Al-Quradahi, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Zayad, he basically came and said that the community of Muslims in South Africa is the freest one anywhere in the world, majority or minority. He joked and he said, try to wear your Palestinian scarf in Mecca.
Yeah.
And you'll see what freedom is or what freedom is not.
Even in Dubai, everybody talks such a high mast about Dubai. You can't wear a kufiya in the streets.
Yes.
You'll be harassed by the private policing, or their public policing, but they wear civilian clothing. And we take for granted the fact that we have a government and a president, by the way. I mean, Comrade Ebrahim, you know this. President Cyril Ramaphosa, in the early days of the Gaza genocide, came out, if you remember that NEC meeting, not just wearing or adorning a kufiya, but where do you get a head of state say we stand with Palestinians before it was popular,
but more than
before
that,
it was a thing?
More than that, the president had his own days of fasting in solidarity with the hunger strike in the jails of Israel. I mean, you don't get more heart than that. And that is why the delegation was so clear that anyone whose hearts beat with the Palestinians, we can treat it as a lapse, but never as an act of immorality by the South African government or the ANC, that they have shown that their morality is intact. And that, I think, is absolutely crucial.
And I think that also paves the way for all of our different local issues, right? You mentioned some of the potholes, the healthcare, the education. All of those things are fundamental also to this morality project and this renewal project of the ANC. And so, in many ways, a vote for the ANC is not just for the Palestinian cause. It's also for that renewal agenda, so that we can get the right people into spaces where we can have a conversation, hopefully 5 years from now, before the next election, and say, look at all the incredible things that this renewal agenda of the ANC has come out with.
And I must tell you that living in Cape Town, Western Cape, you can talk a good talk about Cape Town works, Western Cape works, and the question we must ask is, for whom? Because where I live, under the shadow of Table Mountain, you don't get potholes. You get easy load shedding. Your traffic lights work. Everything is on track. The past few weeks of canvassing in Langa, Nyanga, Manenberg, Delft, Hanover Park, the potholes, the safety issues, the traffic lights that don't work, the state of the housing, all of those kind of things says that those who promise you the world are simply promising it for the already privileged, that are the inheritors of the privileges of apartheid.
Exactly. And I think the Western Cape is a very good example of this tale of two cities, or almost two provinces. And it's much like how we said with the international community, there's one set of rules for blue eyes, blonde hair, and a very different set of rules for people who look like, not just like us, but who are not part of the mold that, I'll say it, that the DA considers a constituency. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, Comrade Ebrahim, and to sort of compare the experience of when the Western Cape was run by the ANC vis-a-vis now by the DA?
Look, we've been very quiet about the contrast between the years of ANC governance and the decades of DA governance after that. But in a debate on radio and Salam Media the other day, the DA boasted that they've got a 20% unemployment rate, whereas
That was fact-checked incorrectly, if I'm right.
that was fact-checked incorrectly.
Yeah, it was incorrect.
But when I contrasted it, I said that when the ANC left that government in 2009, the unemployment rate was 18%. They boast about economic development. Their growth rate in the Western Cape is about 1.5%.
Yep.
When I left the office of Premier, it was 5.8% GDP growth. When we left, they boast about safety. When I left, we had 20,000 Bambanani volunteers in place keeping communities safe. We had 250,000 EPWP people not digging holes. Some of them delivering medicines for the frail at home. Some of them doing community gardens. Some of them able to be community development workers. Some of them actually putting in roads, filling potholes, and all of those kind of things. So the point of the matter is that on every score, we had a situation where we had reached 95% sanitation rates.
Wow.
Those sanitation rates in Nyanga, Guguletu, Kailicha, even the colored townships have receded as you walk through those areas and sewage runs across the road.
I experienced that. I did door-to-door in
Yes.
Guguletu. I experienced exactly what you're saying. It's
And-
worse off now. In fact, I would argue that the townships in the Western Cape are worse than the townships even in Gauteng.
You know, let me be cynical, Fasiha. I think there is a deliberate strategy in the Western Cape to defund African areas as an active disincentive for Africans to come to the Western Cape in order to keep it as an enclave of privilege. And there is an open door policy for what I call the terugtrekkers, those who were the voortrekkers 2 centuries ago, who are now coming back as the terugtrekkers and making the Eden Garden Route the richest enclave in South Africa, because that is where they believe their privileges will be protected against the interest of the black and brown people of the Western Cape.
Comrade Ebrahim, when you spoke about the tale of two cities, I couldn't help but think of some of the reactions of the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape government to Palestinian flags being displayed, or the graffiti in Burqa, pro-Palestinian, of course, and what's been going on in Europe, in US. I mean, right now, students are being attacked in the US for being pro-Palestine. I mean, what kind of comparisons are we seeing there?
You know, Fasiha, before there was police moving into Columbia and other US campuses to break up Palestinian protests, there was a city of Cape Town and a Western Cape government that sent in the police with paintbrushes to paint over Palestinian paraphernalia. Cape Town was ahead of the curve in repressing Palestinian expressions. Before there was the curtailment of Palestinian protests in the USA with violent beatings of professors, lecturers, and students and observers, there we had a situation where the city of Cape Town wanted to demarcate where you can protest and where you can't protest, hiding behind municipal laws, like the universities hid behind obscure university laws for it. And so, by and large, the DA government was signaling all the signals of a repressive US and European set of governments in dealing with the Palestinian protests. Before there was this widening of the laws of what constitutes anti-Semitism in the USA and other places, you already had the DA government, both the city and the Premier of the Western Cape calling on Jews to come to Cape Town as a safe city, to invest there, to buy their homes there, that this can be your alternative safe space in the world. And that begins to explain why the need to crack down on paraphernalia with Palestinian insignia, why the need to crack down on protest so that you can attract Jewish Zionist capital. And more than that, a lot of the funding for what we see going to a party like the DA and other cohorts like the PA, I think are the active investments in that protest-free space that Zionism requires in the world.
And I think it's very clear. I mean, the DA has chosen their side very clearly. But I'm also interested, it's not just been an attack on the Palestinian lobby or those of us who are inclined towards human rights, not only of Palestinians, obviously, but the world over. I'm interested in some of your thoughts about farm workers, about how, I mean, in the earlier years, especially in your run-up to being elected as Premier, the kind of mobilization work that you comrades did in the Western Cape, we always don't quite understand the dynamics there. You know, it's majority colored communities as well, and that's important to understand. And I think yourselves and the comrades on the ground there have really read a different kind of situations. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts around the mobilization, not only of farm workers, but of the working class, and of course linking it to the opposition towards the DA as well.
So particularly farm workers have had an interesting history in the Western Cape. It's moved from, under colonialism, a de facto situation of slavery with a tot system where you don't get paid, but you get given alcohol in return, and hence the perpetuation of fetal alcohol syndrome that persists until today because of the tot system. Then it became a serfdom system in which you lived on the farm, but you were under the mercy of the landowner and so forth. And then with mechanization, with the availability of high-tech farming coming into South Africa after the isolation years, you suddenly had this idea that of seasonality of farm workers, and we want them to get off. So our generation of ANC leaders and government members fought hard for the extension of Security of Tenure Act that makes that when you work on a farm, your family and you should have security of tenure, you should stay there. I think that one of the tragedies of having lost the Western Cape to the DA is that there is now a normality about seasonality. There's a normality about evictions from farms.
And no protection of job
There's
security.
no protection of job security. There is that farm workers are so in need of that wages for 2 or 3 months of the year that they will not want to cause trouble by getting labor brokering has become the fact of life. And so I think we are returning to a situation not necessarily of slavery, but of servitude, of colored farm workers in the Western Cape particularly. And then I think if you then begin to look at its connection with other working class elements, the industrial working class, the urbanized working class people of the Western Cape, there is the activation of other identities. And it's negative identities in the sense that you must fear blacks, the swart gevaar,
Yes.
so that your economic interests are buried under your racial fears. And so it's a very complicated interplay of identities and exploitation of those identities using swart gevaar. And it's not by calling people the K word. It's more sophisticated than that. It's the politics of the dog whistle. It's the politics of speaking about Africans as inkomers, as the people who are intruding into the Western Cape. It is the dog whistle of who's taking our jobs. It's the dog whistle of we wanted to build houses for you here, but the blacks took the land. And so there is a competing rivalry between two different color groups within the working class communities. And the one doesn't know that the other is even worse off. That the one lives in overcrowded conditions in the colored township, the other ones live in squatter camps. They should be. That's why we won the Western Cape on the slogan of an African colored solidarity for a non-racial future. That's why we campaigned on the idea of making the Western Cape a home for all. That's why we had our economic strategy in our time that we called Ikapa Eliklumayo, the Cape that we grow and share. And it was very clear how we would share that. At first it was mechanical. We basically said we will be proportional with each community. That idea is completely gone. There's no proportional tenders even for the entrepreneurial classes. There's no proportional jobs given to all the different communities in the Western Cape. And so it is a really sad situation. It is a paradise if your skin is light. It is a hell if your skin is dark.
And for me, hearing about that, we've read about all these different strategies and mechanisms to keep us the underclass. And so often it's the divide and conquer, right? It's almost textbook what you've described to us. What would you say to this group ahead of the 29th of May?
I would say that the ANC is trying very hard to win your trust again. That we know that we've got to cut through layers and layers of fear and suspicion and engineered rivalry between all sets of people who are poverty-stricken, homeless, down and out, and unemployed. And as the ANC, we will use this election to put down a deposit of trust. But we will have to continue to pay the installments, win or lose the election in the Western Cape, because the trust of people is absolutely more critical than simply the votes of people. I think that the ANC renewing itself renews its non-racialism at the same time, because it's easy to forget people who do not vote for you and appear hostile to you. It's easy to take them out of your mind because you don't want to face their mistrust, you don't want to face their abuse, they don't want to face their slander. But I think because non-racialism is a principle, it is not an expedient for the ANC. We've got to do the hard work, especially in the areas which are hostile to us. We cannot do what other parties do, calculate cynically. If I throw this fear line out, then I will win that vote.
Which is a long-time divisive kind of tool.
Absolutely, and it destroys the fabric of society. It destroys the internal coherence of a community. Sometimes it's sad as a Muslim that Muslims fall for that kind of divide and rule. Their natural instinctive inclination is often towards what is white and to fear what is black. And I think we need to be able, as an ANC, to say this campaign is the deposit on the long-term installment that we must pay, not just for votes, but for non-racialism, for social cohesion, and for general upliftment of all communities in the Western Cape and across the country.
And just before we close, you are the former ambassador for South Africa to the US. And I know there's a lot of people internationally who are going to watch this podcast or interact with it. What is your message to South African voters overseas?
There are probably two classes of South African voters that I would want to address. There are those who pray like me and look like me and dress like me who will be on Hajj for elections. I want to say to those South African Hujjaj who will be in Mecca and Medina over the election period, you should be the most conscious of what God wants you to do. You must go into that ballot box with God next to you to guide your steps, so that that little bit of racism that withholds you from doing what your ulama wants us to do, to vote for the ANC in order to win a free Palestine, you've got to be more conscious that that's what God wants you to do, rather than indulge your fear of black people or your love for the DA, because they are, at the end of the day, the enemies of God. And then I want to speak to those South Africans who find themselves all over. And then I want to subdivide those South Africans because I've worked with them in places like the United States. The United States has 83,000 South African expatriates living there. Most of them fled because they feared a black government. We reached out to them. We know that they are South African because they support the Springboks. We are saying to you, you have nothing, you have a great life there. What you should be doing for your families back home is to invest in trust and in hope and to make sure that you find it in your heart to vote for the ANC as the stable government that will rule. I want to tell you, the most the moonshot can get is 28%. Even if on the other side, to the left of the ANC, all those left parties together get something like 10%. 10 and 28 never becomes 51.
Sure.
The ANC is an essential part of any government, alone or in coalition. Put your faith and make the ANC conscious that you have voted for them so that the ANC does not forget you out of the radar of its mind because you have defined yourself as hostile. And then I think that there are young South Africans free of the stain of apartheid, having been the first beneficiaries of a non-racial, constitutional, democratic South Africa who got the best education, state-sponsored education, doctors, lawyers, financial whiz kids, technological experts working all over the world. That mobility is the gift of the ANC to you. Under apartheid, even if you're white, you could not move out of this country to take up those jobs because though South Africa was the pariah state in the world, now you can go there with pride. That is not a pride that the DA gave you. That is a pride that the ANC gave to you. And the best you can do is to make sure that that ANC stays in power so that your skills can eventually help to rebuild our damaged country and that you're never a stranger, you're never hostile to the nation that made you as mobile as what you are.
Thanks very much, Comrade Ebrahim. I think from us at ANC Connect, fascinating discussion, but also reminding us of what our true values and principles are. And the fact of the matter is it can only be the African National Congress that brings about a non-racial, non-sexist, fair and equal democratic society. And so on the 29th of May, don't make a mistake. Ballot 1, ballot 2, ballot 3. African National Congress. See you in the next episode.